psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident, all called Dennis Jones. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he didn't, wouldn't, and couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact, seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of him being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared an absent without official leave for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a Virginia hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Dennis Jones, and I have been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said that they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative, and demanded not to be contacted again. Dennis paced all day, every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat, but if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughing, mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him, either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing, because Dennis would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Dennis pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I've been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I am on an all-call victim support team, so I often ended up at the hospital at odd hours. This was around 4 a.m. I just finished doing my thing. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, collecting myself and writing notes for my report, when I see someone out of the corner of my eye. I clearly saw the blue of a hospital gown, but when I looked over, no one was there. I figure I'm just tired and riding out the adrenaline of the call, so I go back to doing my thing. After a few minutes, I once again spot something out of the corner of my eye. This time, when I look up, someone is there. Standing on the curb in front of the hospital, I see a man in his mid to late 50s. Thin hair up top, no facial hair. He's wearing a hospital gown and holding onto something metal. But from my angle, I couldn't tell if it was an ivy pole or a crutch. He wasn't leaning on it. He had this expression on his face of wide-eyed shock, with his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to think of something to say and had totally stalled out. At this point, I start glancing around for staff or something, because this man doesn't look like he should be outside alone. His skin is a messed up pale color, and he's barefoot. I can't see his feet well with the shadows, but his hand and fingers look bruised. As I'm looking around for staff, our eyes meet. I know he sees me. I start thinking, okay, this guy can't wander around alone, half naked and unmasked. I have huge chills, but I turn to grab my mask and get out of my car to help guide him back inside. When I look up again, he's gone. I looked all over the parking lot for him, but he was gone. There's no way he could have vanished like that in the split second it took me to grab my mask. I don't know how to explain this without sounding dramatic, but my skin crawled when he looked at me. He looked like a guy who was slowly realizing he died and didn't know what to do now. I still think about it. Growing up, my maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up, just as a preface. So while mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig, working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally 5, though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her own giant, beautiful home, fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money and a fund to finance care, etc. So my mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary, because she did not like new people. 2 midnighters and 2 day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I actually have an old photo of me, her, and mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, On a day Mom was off work, but had nursing school. She got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late to school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone, dialing people who were not answering her. I will never, ever forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside, patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something Mom did. But when she sat up in the bed, Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell Mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her.